This podcast is sponsored by Reflex Medical. Reflex Medical specialise in consumables and equipment supply solutions for clinicians in pre-hospital care. Their product range includes advanced diagnostics, syringes, cannulas, defibrillators and everything in between, with a commitment to enhance patient care and healthcare efficiency. With a passion for advancing patient care and safety, Reflex Medical strive to address evolving healthcare challenges, ensuring their contributions lead to improved treatment and overall well-being. Through dedicated research and development, their aim is to shape the future of pre-hospital care with a positive impact on the healthcare industry globally. To explore their range of products and services, see the show notes for further details. Also check out the show notes for a 10% discount code on their products. Many thanks. This podcast is brought to you by CLOX Medical. CLOX Medical offers innovative hemostatic solutions for managing moderate to severe bleeding in emergency medical settings. Their advanced products like CLOX granules and gauze harness chitosan's clotting properties to swiftly control hemorrhage. Specifically designed for healthcare professionals and emergency responders, CLOX Medical's range ensures rapid and effective clotting even in complex scenarios. This facilitates emergency and interventional procedures. Their range strictly adheres to safety standards and also empowers medical teams to address critical bleeding situations with confidence. So CLOX Medical's commitment to efficacy and safety make it the hemostatic solution indispensable to hospitals, clinics and emergency care units, enhancing patient outcomes but also saving lives by stopping bleeding efficiently. Through dedication to research and development, they aim to shape the future of hemorrhage control and make a positive impact on the healthcare industry but ultimately save lives worldwide. To explore their range of products and services, please see the show notes for further details.
You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.
Welcome back to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast with myself, Owen Walker. In this episode, I'm speaking on major incidents from a Scottish perspective with John Paul Loughrey. So what to do in the conversation is explore some of the lessons learned through years of major incident attendance in Scotland from the Emergency Medical Retrieval Service, or EMRS. So we're going to examine in the episode the Scottish Trauma Network, the demographics of healthcare in Scotland. We'll also look at some of the recent and seminal major incidents that have informed EMRS's approach. We're also going to look at some of the lessons learned through the Manchester bombings, so that of paediatric triage and treatment in mass casualty incidents. We're also going to examine some of the lessons learned through using CSCATTT, METHANE, activation and tasking, communications both remotely and at site, preferred triage tools, and much more. So to do this, I have John Paul Loughrey with me. JP is a consultant in emergency medicine at Queen Elizabeth University Hospital, Glasgow. So he's also worked with EMRS in a variety of roles since 2011. So JP is the major lead for ScotSTAR, and he's also the Vice President of the Royal College of Emergency Medicine. In addition, his other main professional interests include major trauma care, teaching and training, and organising large-scale CPD events and conferences. JP, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks very much for having me on.
I wonder if we could just start by getting you to speak to the geography and indeed demographics of Scotland and why this poses challenges in regard to major incident resourcing and streaming of patients.
Yeah, that's a really good question to start with because some of the unique aspects and properties of Scotland have led to the setup of the ambulance service and of our team as well. So Scotland is a big place. It's around a third of the landmass of the UK and it's got a population of about 5.5 million. 80% of that population lives in what we would call urban areas, and largely that's across the central belt, Glasgow to Edinburgh. About 90% of the population live within 45 minutes drive time to hospital, but 45-minute drive time to hospital only actually covers about 45% of our landmass, so there's quite big swathes, and some of the north and west of Scotland is amongst the least densely populated areas anywhere in Europe as well. We've got 95 inhabited islands, and there's about 103,000 people live in those islands. So there are large numbers of patients who require equitable and equal access to critical care, both resuscitation and safe transfer and retrieval to tertiary care or definitive care. And that really was the reason why our service came to be, initially as a voluntary service, but increasingly and then moved into a government-funded and part of the ambulance service model, integral now to the operations of delivering healthcare to remote and rural areas across the country, both in the safe transfer and retrieval, but also in attending pre-hospital incidents and in supporting the delivery of safe medical care at major incident scenes with the ambulance service.
That's fantastic, JP, and really encompassing, like you said, from a quite a disparate population, concentrated in some ways and then dispersed in others. But could you speak to the inception of the Scottish Trauma Network, how it looks currently, and how it serves the people of Scotland?
The Scottish Trauma Network, as you might expect, has been an enormous piece of work over the last decade to develop and establish and go live during a pandemic, which was an interesting time. Parts of the country had almost a de facto trauma network for a long time because it had one large tertiary centre with all the services you might expect in a so-called major trauma centre, and then smaller hospitals, district generals that would feed into that hospital. So I talk about areas like Grampian, where they have Aberdeen Royal Infirmary, which is now a major trauma centre covering the Grampian area, but for a long time has served the remote and rural areas as the hub for patients coming to there. Similar of Ninewells in Dundee, which covers the Tayside area, and those were the first two major trauma networks as part of the larger Scottish network that went live over the last 5 years. Then we have Edinburgh, where we have the Royal Infirmary of Edinburgh, again a very large tertiary centre, multiple, as you would expect, trauma services centralised there, and other smaller hospitals. But importantly, it also has a paediatric major trauma centre and one of Scotland's two paediatric intensive care units. And then we come into the issue of the west of Scotland, where the largest part of the population is centred around Glasgow and the Lanarkshire area and Ayrshire. So that means that there are a large number of hospitals in that area which delivered excellent care in major trauma and in critical care and continue to do so to this day. However, that was the most complicated part of the launch of the trauma network, was establishing the biggest major trauma centre in Scotland at the QE in Glasgow and the Royal Hospital for Children at Glasgow, which is also one of the biggest paediatric receiving hospitals anywhere in the UK. That meant that then the establishment of trauma units within Glasgow and the surrounding areas, and some of those hospitals being designated as local emergency hospitals, resulted in new ways of working, including things like bypass, which has not generally been something that happened in Scotland, where ambulance staff, technicians, paramedics would be asked to deliver patients to the hospital best matched to their needs for the level of injury or severity of their trauma, as expected by using things like trauma triage tools. So this has been an enormous piece of work, as I said, during a pandemic and with the current fiscal challenges. Certain elements of it I'd just like to flag up that are not unique but are integral to the running of our trauma network, and main in that is our critical care desk, previously known as the trauma desk, where we have an advanced practitioner sitting examining treble 9 calls all across Scotland and sending enhanced assets and resources to those incidents where we, either red teams, critical care teams, can deliver advanced critical care interventions to medical and trauma emergencies, wherever they are, but also the advanced practitioners in critical care who go to a huge number of both medical and trauma emergencies and deliver enhanced skills, care and leadership to seriously ill and injured patients in support of our green level responders, the paramedics and technicians that do the grunt work, they do the bulk of the work. 80% of the patients with major trauma in Scotland are looked after by those people, and most of the things that major trauma patients need are delivered by those people. Things like intravenous analgesia, splinting, basic airway manoeuvres. So it's really, we are a small part of a big network, and there's numbers of people in the centre of that make it function really effectively, both in selecting which teams to send to which jobs, but also supporting technicians, paramedics out on the road with difficult situations sometimes of deciding whether to drive directly past the hospital to go to one that's more likely to achieve the care that the patient needs.
As you said, JP, it really starts with that focused triage and indeed dispatch. So from the control room, and then the allocation of resources accordingly, and the good communication bilaterally from teams on the ground to yourselves. But could I get you to speak actually to the, because embedded within that is a plan, is a major incident plan, and Scottish Ambulance Service, or SAS, sort of vocalised that plan, or indeed published that plan in last year in 2022. We're going to do a deep dive into major incidents in Scotland, and some of the seminal events in the past, some of the most challenging events, such as paediatric major incidents. But before we do so, could I get you to speak to how the Emergency Medical Retrieval Service fits into the larger major incident plan within the Scottish Ambulance Service.
Yeah, so the Scottish Ambulance Services Major Incident Plan has been an iterative process. I can't remember which version we're on now, but it's at least 7. And there had been a gap in updates to the plan, such that certain elements of it were no longer up to date or relevant for the way that current pre-hospital critical care or trauma care is delivered. So over the last 4 or 5 years, myself and a colleague from the Emergency Medical Retrieval Service, Tim Park, who's one of the Associate Medical Directors, have been almost embedded with our National Risk and Resilience team, with the planning teams, in order to make a proper plan that reflects the scope and work of the ambulance service in the current day and age. That really has to then recognise the fact that we as an ambulance service have doctors, have medical teams embedded within our ambulance service. We're not a separate charitable entity. We are a taskable asset at the control of the ambulance service. We therefore have to accept that our action cards, our roles and responsibilities have to accurately be described in that plan, but also who is in charge, who has primacy, and what the roles of all of those essential advisory roles like medical incident officer, or one role we have in Scotland of the tactical medical advisor, which I'll come on to in a moment. They're embedded directly into that plan so that people in ambulance control, ambulance incident commanders at scene, and those at tactical and strategic levels understand what assets they have available and what those assets are able to deliver. The ambulance incident commander, that's a job I would not relish, with the volume of decisions and responsibility that sometimes feels like it's landing on that one individual, but they have a lot of help available to them. So there's often a tactical advisor who is a senior member of ambulance service, usually managerial, and with enhanced and lots of experience and training and incident command. And they're there in support of the AIC in order to deliver the best medical care. But the medical incident officer, and that's an important distinction, is that we are an officer who work under the AIC. We're there to support delivery of medical teams there, and also the care that the medical teams will deliver, as well as offering advice and support to the AIC in terms of casualty distribution, and about triage decisions and thresholds for intervention. And then the last role that's now described in our major incident plan, which is, I think, a really interesting and unique thing, is our tactical medical advisor, whereby one of the consultants from the West Emergency Medical Retrieval Service go up to ambulance control and sit next to the critical care desk clinician. We then can listen into the talk group for the major incident. We can communicate directly to the emergency departments, to the halos, to the health boards, to offer them information, but also an avenue for them to get further information, and that addresses some of the communication issues. We can help support the AIC and the MIO in what they need. So what logistics do you need? What transport platforms do you need? Are you running out of equipment, drugs, blood, etc.? And also then as a bit of a lightning rod for all information requests to come on what medical care has been delivered. So when Strategic Command are asking what care are we delivering, where are all these patients going to, that can really help in establishing that single point of truth for what we know at that time, with someone that's got the bandwidth and the headspace without having to physically deliver clinical care at the scene, can help to support so that some of those people have the cognitive space to be able to go and do their best job.
So what we're going to do, JP, is pan out and look at sort of some seminal learning cases from the last 20 years. Before we do, I'm actually going to go and look quite focally at the Manchester bombings, because and the reason I'm going to ask about that and your perspective on that is because it posed significant challenges, not only in paediatric triage, but paediatric treatment and casualty clearing, and indeed the funneling of patients to critical care beds, to paediatric critical care intensivists. And it was, I suppose, a seminal case for a number of reasons. But could I get you to, before we pan back and look at the sort of last 20 years, could I get you to speak to what you took from the Manchester bombings, and indeed how you've adapted your major incident plan as a result?
We have a big group in the ambulance service actually looking at the recommendations from the inquiry and looking at all of those that are relevant both to ambulance services but also to pre-hospital critical care teams, because there was a lot certainly drawn out of that report for us to consider and adapt our plan as we move forward, and that's something I think we could probably talk on for an hour or two. There's a few bits that the Manchester thing really struck home for me. So the first one for me was that Manchester is almost similar to the west of Scotland, and it's a major trauma network, but not all major trauma services are necessarily contained in one centre. For example, things like cardiothoracics in the west of Scotland are contained what we call off-site. But our co-located paediatric major trauma centre with an adult major trauma centre allows us to steal some of the ways that people operated during the Manchester Arena incident in order to keep family units together. So one of the things that we learned about from that, and it seems to now be a big push, is that major incident triage needs to be modernised and needs to reflect the needs of our patients, both in the differences in paediatrics, but also how we approach children during a major incident, because that's something, fortunately, we don't have to do too often, but I'm sure from personal experience it is something that does add a layer of difficulty and cognitive overload. The push of casualties from major incident scenes rather than hospitals pooling along predetermined casualty distribution plans is something that I think will have a transformative improvement for patients going to hospitals, because in a major incident and in the current climate when every hospital is full to bursting with ambulances queued outside, you could imagine the response you would get from asking a health board how many major incident patients do you think you could take. That is likely to be in the low single figures, which just isn't realistic and will result in delays. So these predetermined distribution plans, which outline on the worst day at the worst time how many patients could you realistically manage, and that then gives us, in the support roles and the ambulance incident commander, a framework with which to start to distribute casualties to hospitals best matched to their needs, but also those that then can handle larger numbers of patients, and making sure that we don't overload or overwhelm any individual hospital or health board. And as I've said, keeping family units together was something that I took a great deal from in the Manchester incident. Looking at where patients were best to go to often meant that the patient with the worst injuries took primacy, so paediatric trauma going to the paediatric centre, but the adult, the relative, perhaps being admitted alongside them for sometimes relatively minor injuries. And then lastly, the difficulties sometimes in trying to plan adequately for paediatric major incidents, but paediatric emergency departments and critical care units are overloaded, busy, but also very small in number. And in a major incident with large numbers of paediatric or adolescent patients, perhaps reverting to the old definitions of paediatric and adult. So in Scotland, we would use about the 12 3/4, so the sort of secondary school age versus primary school age, such that if there were an overwhelming number of children injured in one of these incidents, keeping the paediatric centre capable of managing those smallest children meant that some of those under 16s but larger children could be managed in adult major trauma centres. Many of those patients are, taller than some of our retrieval practitioners, who, if they're listening, will know exactly who I'm talking about, bigger than our nurses. And the difficulty is as well, don't carry identification, so actually picking out how old they are can be very challenging. But using Brouslow tapes, judging based on patient size and patient age reported or by them or by family, but trying to make sure that we focus the capabilities of our paediatric centres on those that they really can help with, because a 13-year-old, 14-year-old adult paediatric trauma patient can be managed very similar to those in the adults. And then the last thing is in the arena inquiry, certainly a lot has been read, written, a lot of the videos that we've seen of the inquiry itself resulted in some very difficult conversations for people in the way that they felt scrutinised by the inquiry and the reports in the press and things afterwards. So a few things that I have certainly pushed for my team to do, such as ensuring 100% of the time that we keep a contemporaneous log of our decisions and that our post-incident log and notes is produced immediately after the incident, ensuring that we've got as contemporaneous and accurate a record of what happened is as important as anything else. And also just making sure that we train as best we can. So making time for training, establishing that is crucially important to prepare our teams, but also learning the lessons from that training, because if we have these training exercises, lessons are identified to be learned from, we have to actually use those to improve and shape. And that's something that we have certainly established in Scotland a long time ago, large multi-casualty incidents with lots of different disciplines attending them.
So this is quite a large question, actually, JP, and probably lends itself to, again, a podcast of its own. But could you speak to some of the sort of major incidents over the past 20 years in Scotland that you have either been privy to yourself or indeed been identified, and just some of the seminal learning points that you've taken from major incidents over the past 20 years, and indeed that you confer to future registrars that might join the service, or indeed consultants.
Feel free to interrupt me if you need to. I could go on about this for a long, long time. So my own interest in major incidents actually started when I was a finishing up medical student in 2004, when there was an incident in Maryhill in the north of the city, referred to as Stockline, where a plastics distribution factory in the north of the city exploded at around midday in the middle of May. There was about 100 people in the factory. 9 people died and there were 33 injured, with 15 of them seriously injured. This is back before we had an established pre-hospital critical care team. This was even back before we had things like predetermined casualty distribution plans. And this was back when hospitals would be identified as receiving, for the major incident, serious casualties, less serious casualties, the hospital that was receiving business as usual, and then a hospital identified to start to provide site medical teams. The thing that I have taken from this and I've learned from this is that these are particularly challenging and hazardous situations to deploy people into that perhaps haven't had training. And until you've done the training or been to some of these incidents, you don't know what you don't know. And actually, sometimes the role for doctors or critical care teams in these is only getting involved in warmer zones or warmer areas when there are hazards, when it's safe and necessary to do so. So if I give the example of the collapsed building at Stockline, I don't know what all of the hazards could potentially be in that, because I've got little experience in search and rescue, ISAR, or indeed working in those zones. So I know that if I am being asked to respond into one of those, it's because someone has established that it's safe to do so, that it's necessary for my level of skills and experience to go forwards, deliver my interventions in order to safely extricate the casualty. So that really is one that reflects the way that previously local health boards would be asked to call out medical teams who would often go into that cupboard in the emergency department, find the high visibility jacket, the boots, get a sick bowl full of drugs and dust off some equipment and try and remind yourself of how these things happen, be given a radio that you've never operated or used before and a hard hat that doesn't fit, and be asked to work in these pretty hazardous and challenging scenarios that you may have never been in before. That won't happen in Scotland now, outside of very rural areas where the local responders may also be basic Scotland responders. Now, in the bulk of the population, we would have the local pre-hospital critical care team would be deployed as the MIO team. And were it to be a large-scale incident that required multiple teams, because of the size and nature of our team, EMRS West, we're able to provide mutual aid, mutual support, and deliver further teams for the site medical care, forward teams, and casualty cleaning. Because some of those critical care teams in Scotland, like those in Edinburgh and Dundee, it's an ED call-out based team, so someone designated for that day to respond to those jobs. That then depletes the local major trauma centre of a usually consultant registrar and nurse. We can't then expect them to provide 2, 3, 4, 5 teams to the site and then still have some staff to operate in the hospital behind them. So that's something that's matured over years and has developed thanks in no small part to the support of the ambulance service, but and the local health boards recognising that actually there might be a better way and a safer way to do this. So that was the one that got my interest piqued. There were then a couple of bus crash type major incidents, which are not uncommon and deliver the standard number of major incident patients that we would typically see. So one that I was involved in as the medical incident advisor or officer was the Clydeside Expressway bus crash, which happened late one Sunday afternoon. Coincidentally, it happened after there was a large football derby in Glasgow. So both large hospitals in Glasgow were extremely busy. It kind of feels like a very busy city whenever we've had one of these football matches. So around 6 o'clock, a bus crashed into a concrete column holding up one of the lights on effectively a expressway carriageway, which looks very much like a motorway running into the city centre. What we learned a great deal from that one was about the difficulties in extricating casualties out of a busy scenario like that in a timely fashion, and how we have to aim to do better in terms of providing analgesia for patients with relatively lower acuity trauma. So that might just be broken arms, it might be a dislocated shoulder. These are by definition P3 patients. But if they're going to spend 2 hours at the scene before they're able to be transferred to hospital, we need to do more for them than just put a sling on them and tell them they'll get there eventually. So we learned a lot about that. I personally learned about the hazards of these environments from that incident as well, because this was in late April, I believe, from memory. And even then, we were starting to get cold from being on scene for several hours as it went from afternoon into evening into dusk. There was broken glass everywhere. The bus that had crashed itself was tipping at a considerable angle, and the fire service took drastic measures to try and secure that, including where they'd parked one of their heavy rescue vehicles and one of the big fire tenders. There were also ambulances and police vehicles in from both ends of the incident, which almost divided it into 2 sectors, but meant it was difficult to get ambulances out. So when we look at the access and egress part of METHANE, that's the one that always chimes that bell in my memory for that bus crash. We then had another incident in M&D's, which was Scotland's national theme park, based just outside, about 15 minutes outside Glasgow at Strathclyde Park, whereby a roller coaster ride detached from its rails and fell and landed on a small carriageway ride for toddlers. And we saw the exact scene of this from social media. And this is another thing that I learned from this one. In the modern day and age, major incidents don't seem to happen without people having a camera. And that's something I learned a great deal about from that and several incidents since then, is that always expect that someone's going to be taking your picture, filming you, and that might be live on international television. So for clinicians out there responding to these, it's game face on, please. It's 100% professionalism. It's look as if you think the public would want pre-hospital providers to look. We know that at times there are, downtimes in these incidents where not much is happening and you can stand around and chat and things, but how the optics of that reflect is important. But the other part about that is we had multiple paediatric patients involved in this. And although all the hospitals in Glasgow were activated to receive definitive care level patients, so major trauma patients, including paediatric, that needed to go directly there, rather than to the 3, at the time, district general hospitals in Lanarkshire. But the naming of hospitals is also really important. So in Glasgow, we have what's called the Glasgow Royal Infirmary. We have the Royal Hospital for Children Glasgow, which is based at the QE campus. And then we have the Royal Alexandra Hospital in Paisley. So we have 3 Royals in the same place. And inadvertently, one hospital was stood up to receive a casualty with severe upper limb trauma that had had a pre-hospital anaesthetic. And the adult Royal was stood up to receive those when in actual fact the patient was paediatric and went to the Royal Hospital for Children. So that was a big thing that I learned from that one, is just how we communicate and refer to these places has to be 100% clear. Looking forward, we've had a few incidents recently, and we had a couple during lockdown times that could have been much, much worse. So if I look at the one at Stonehaven, where we had the train derailment after the storms and landslide, that was an incident where we provided multiple teams from the west, so EMRS West, but also multiple teams from our branch, our colleagues in the north, EMRS North. And it was the first time that we had responded to a major incident in such a way whereby we had teams from the west operating under the direction of a consultant from another part of the service. The communication in that incident was really, really difficult because it was down a deep ravine. So the consultant who was down in that ravine had no idea how many resources had appeared behind him. So there were multiple medical teams. And again, we were witnessing and watching this live from press helicopters from Sky News, broadcasting live the images from overhead. So we had a very clear image of where the scene was, how the location of the train had divided that into multiple sectors. We also knew that this was a commuter train between 2 cities in Scotland, and were this not the pandemic, there could have been many, many more casualties on the train. As it were, unfortunately, there were 3 deaths and 6 injured, but it could have been far, far worse. I was tactical medical advisor for that incident, so I was getting questions up in ambulance control. Fortuitously, there was a meeting of the Scottish Trauma Network on that day, which then fed into the strategic level, and we're getting questions on the carriage was on fire. Are we going to be receiving multiple burns patients? Is this going to be a burns major incident? But fortunately, very few of the patients who were injured required that tertiary level burns type care. And we've practiced and drilled about safety, but from a vehicle damaging one of our parts of machinery and also destroying part of a major incident log, we learned a lot about that personal safety and buddy safety, about looking after each other and making sure that we're perfectly safe. And then just coming up to more recent times, we had the incident on 22nd of March where the boat tipped over in the docks in Leith over in Edinburgh. I refer to this one as Sunshine on Leith because it was actually a beautiful day. It was actually my birthday, so I wasn't activated to this one. But we had teams from Edinburgh and from Glasgow operating on the same major incident field, showing that the Jets and the Sharks can seem to get along when they need to. We were under the direction of an ambulance incident commander that was a local manager, but the MIO for this was one of the consultants from Medic 1 in Edinburgh. And they then performed that role with the support of our teams there to provide forward incident care and medical teams, but also to require to transfer the patients to hospital such that the local critical care team could remain in that advisory officer role to support the local AIC, but that we were then able to take some of those decisions on what levels of actual treatment needed to be delivered both there and then, and also in supporting the distribution of casualties across Edinburgh and Fife to make sure they got to the right place for the injuries that they had. So that really illustrated to me how far we've come, both as individuals in the service, both our service as part of the ambulance service, but the ambulance service as a whole, with the joint training that the guys in Edinburgh and Medic 1 do with their local SORT team, the training that we do with them, and having joint CPD days where they come through to us because we have a bigger base and a bigger service with more team members. But we've had the teams from Edinburgh and Dundee join us for CPD days and training, and that can't be understated, the importance of that, and getting some of these difficult issues done in the cold light of day so that when it's game time and you're at the scene, all of these difficult decisions have already been made, action cards have been tweaked, you know your job. It's the Bill Belichick, know your job, know your role, just do what you're told to do. And actually the rest of it should have been planned and decided in advance. So that really kind of underlined to me how far we've come as the Scottish Ambulance Service in delivering medical care at major incidents.
That's fantastic, JP. And like you said, that illustrates the team of teams, really. So a number of teams working together in a cohesive way, whereby it's clear, concise mandates. There's the crossover is complementary, but there is just this clear lines of communication, clear lines of reporting. Because I think my next question is exactly to that point. And I'd just like you to speak to and unpack the entropy in these scenes and how difficult it is to differentiate sort of the signal from the noise, and that anyone who's been to a major incident can testify just how much noise and how much malaise can occur in these scenes, and how maybe that causes or mandates the need to keep things simple and to keep communication and plans simple. And it doesn't take much interagency working to see how this malaise builds. Could you maybe speak to the entropy at scene?
Yeah, it's entropy. I've got a slide on that in one of the induction talks I give to our registrars. It's a word I love. And I think a few of the things that we have recognised from our training in these, as well as from several of the actual incidents, is that actually getting some organisation out of the chaos. I call it, our tagline in ScotSTAR is critical care anywhere, but I like to call it in major incident critical care while herding cats, because the numbers of people that respond both from ambulance services, from police, from fire are enormous. There's always bystanders and well-meaning people trying to help out. The first people on scene, and I've not been first on scene at a major incident yet, but the reports to me from the first on scene is just people grabbing you and trying to get you to go to their patient. So they've got someone they're really worried about, their relative is really sick or injured. And stepping back from that initial gut instinct of wanting to get your hands on and start delivering the care that you're trained to do for that one patient, but to take that step back, put on your tabard, change your mindset and take on the command role. Doing that very early on means that you don't get locked into that one patient really quickly. One of the methods that we've seen for this from other services, and it's one of the benefits of things like medical Twitter, as well as pre-hospital teams speaking to each other and training together, is the concept of the windscreen report. It's actually getting onto one of these, seeing that it looks big, may potentially be a major incident, and declaring it as a major incident standby early actually allows the the activation of assets, but they can be rapidly rolled back if it turns out to be less severe. I think that's a big boon in the recent years that allows us to describe early doors what we know to be true, what we are concerned about, and what we think we need in that bit. The other thing that I think it's really important to do, I've said it before, but I don't think it can be said too many times, is about training. So we have had several large-scale multi-casualty exercises with actors, with live casualties, some of them mannequin. Some of those actors can really push you to the limits of, I think this is a real patient. I'm about to cannulate this person who's telling me not to because actually it's an actor. The stress response that you experience in these incidents is something that you have to inoculate yourself to by having done it a few times. The noise, the physically demanding environment, what you see, what you hear, what you smell, all of those things can overload you really quickly. Unless you've practiced that multiple times such that that still bothers you, but you recognise, acknowledge that and move on to be able to do your job is hugely important. And then the last thing I think is about making sure that our action plans, our operation guides, our major incident plans, but importantly our role cards are appropriate for what we're about to do. I can't read a full page of 11-point text during one of these, and we've adapted our action cards to reflect that. I have leg board inserts for things like the methane, which just reminds me every time. I've talked about methane probably for 10,000 hours now, so I should be more expert in it, but I still refer to aid memoirs. And having those initial actions on a leg board of, if this is a major incident, do these 6 things, and if you do that and then take a breath, you're right into it. You've done all the right things to get yourself off on the right foot. So I think those are the elements that I would say that manage to kind of get, out of the panic and out of the chaos. You can get some organisation. You can start to get some forward flow towards hospitals, because that's the other thing that can happen. You can be a long way into these incidents and no one's left the scene because we're now in the right, everybody's been triaged, we know what we've got, no one's immediately about to die, therefore we've got some time, and then there's that little slowdown. It's what happens at pre-hospital critical care incidents. There is an inertia that starts once we start delivering advanced interventions, and we rely then on our colleagues in the ambulance service to give us reminders of how long we've been on scene, and actually we need to start making decisions on getting people out of here and to hospital.
I think those cognitive prompts are absolutely essential, JP, because as you said, actually time dilation actually occurs quite frequently, especially when there's a feeling of overwhelm, and being able to really appropriate that 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes is key to, like you said, decision making. Could you maybe speak to what you've taken from some of the acronyms and indeed checklists, which are fantastic because, like you said, there are these cognitive aids such as CSCATTT. So this, command and control, the safety, the communication, the assessment, triage, treatment, transport, and methane. One of the things I realized about methane from my working was that actually giving updated methane reports was hugely beneficial to either the silver commander or indeed the bronze commander on scene, because there was quite frequently a constant changing number of patients which were and actually distilling the actual number of patients of P1s, P2s, or Pro 2 1, Pro 2, Pro 3 patients. So and this number would change quite frequently. So giving, regular 5 or 10 minute updated methanes or ethanes to kind of share the mental model. Could you maybe speak to the learning you've taken from using these acronyms?
Sure. I love methane because it's so simple, but it also captures the bits that people forget regularly during these. That starts right off with major incident, either standby or declared. Has this large incident actually been declared? Have we told someone in ambulance control or centrally that we are concerned that this is actually a major incident? And it can be some time into one of these before we realise that actually we haven't even declared this and it should be. That early standby, which can then be upgraded to declared, has been used. The expressway bus crash, for example, that was standby, we were activated, and as we were driving to base to get our kit was declared. So that was great, that happened remotely, but it also knew straight away what the response would be in activating all the resources that were required. Other bits in methane that are often forgotten about, so the hazards is something that we talk a little about, but using, again, aid memoirs, apps, things to take that little bit of cognitive load away from you. I'm looking at the Prometheus methane app that's got checkpoints of what hazards are available from a pop-up menu. Elements like that, apps like that, and we have this in our own app as well, takes away the forgetting about, fuel as a potential hazard. There's an electric car on fire, that's a big hazard, glass, temperature, all those things. And up in Scotland, the environment, we can't, say things like the midgie in Scotland without people worrying about having a major incident with midges. The other bit that we forget about in methane is about access and egress, and that, has been drilled into me from seeing this in several incidents where not identifying access and egress very quickly has resulted in a much harder time for us trying to then work that out 45 minutes, 60 minutes in. If that's identified very early on, that can be blocked off, cordoned off. Ambulances can be loaded pointing in the same direction. And then roles like an ambulance loading officer, which seems like such a boring job, but it's actually one of the best jobs in terms of getting people to hospital, to the right hospital, making sure logs are kept, including the numbers of casualties. Because those numbers of casualties can change as they change in triage category, as we deliver interventions, or as actually it turns out that some of them aren't injured at all. So it gives us a really nice structured language. It's like the CABC or the ATE of ATLS. It gives us something to fall back on. And in the same way, in an ATLS moulage, if we start getting lost, we go back to our principles, we go back to CABC, and that gives us the process that we can go through each time, and updating that, but in particular with the updated casualty numbers, is a really important way of communicating on that top group so that everybody responding but also monitoring that major incident knows exactly what's going on. And CSCATTT, the elements in that I look at as being delivered in order. So first bit about command and control, but if you don't have that established as the first thing, it's really difficult to get that back. And having seen, been involved in enough pre-hospital incidents where someone's become injured or equipment's become damaged, safety is, hugely important. And again, thinking of that early, making sure you're donned your PPE, you're not going into hazardous areas unless it's safe to do so. That's, one of those things that's really easy to skirt over. Say that you've done your dynamic risk assessment, look around and then go ahead. It's actually important to take that step back. Then about the comms and assessment, and only then, once all of those essential underpinning foundations have been put in, then we start to do the triage, treatment and transport. Because if we just start going straight into triage and treatment, we forget some of those important aspects, and that's why things like a methane message wouldn't be transmitted straight away. So using these to, offload some of that thinking that can be so difficult to do during any incident, never mind a major incident. These little cognitive aids are something that I've learned from my time in pre-hospital care, that no one is too big, too important, or too smart to use these. And I actually now sort of look down on people that sneer when you pull out a checklist before delivering an anaesthetic. I think that these are great. I always find something on them that I've missed, and that's the worry, is if that's a mission critical or intervention critical piece of kit or communication or something that you've not done, and you thought that you knew it but you haven't done it, then it takes a long time to fix that, or there can be negative consequences. So I think these checklists and aid memoirs are hugely important and something that all of healthcare needs to learn from and adapt to.
JP, looking at the way in which activation of colleagues occur, there is challenges, especially in a disparate workforce that are stationed in various locations, really, and especially, like you said, the nuances of a major incident a lot of them occur outside of normal hours, so outside of social hours, outside of working hours, outside of office hours. Could you speak to the activation of colleagues either on or off shift? How does EMRS approach this?
We have changed the way that we've done this over the years a few times as we moved from based with the ambulance service but not part of the ambulance service to being fully integrated in the ambulance service. So now our activation comes via our specialist services desk and critical care desk with an ambulance control. They organise and manage all of our calls, our logistics, our transport, and they do a huge amount of work such that when it's a very busy day, they are one of the busiest people in the whole ambulance control centre. But they would activate either for us, or we would tell them that we were activating the EMRS major incident response. And what happens there via an app-based activation via PIN code access is that sends out a notification alert onto all of our own personal devices. So that comes through as a very invasive and intrusive klaxon, which can't be silenced, which is intentional, so that if you're playing with your phone, you don't accidentally hit stop. It comes through if you have data, so even if you're on Do Not Disturb, and that gets by some of the, what if you're asleep and you have Do Not Disturb on? Well, that'll do that as well. And that means that anybody within the operational team, so that's consultants, retrieval practitioners, our admin support team, and importantly, one of the mobile phones held within the specialist services desk, which is on our app activation as well, they're all notified at the same time and start that cascade such that the duty teams know their role. The retrieval practitioners, registrars and fellows, the second team members, and hugely important team members that I can't do any job without, they, if they're available, go straight to base, as does one of our admin support team, and they help to make sure that things are starting to get ready. All of the consultants then, and we have about 32, 33 consultants who provide sessions to the team in the west and about another 10 or 12 in the north, are given a number which phones into the ambulance control centre on an emergency line, queues us up in order, and when we phone in, they will say, "You are consultant number 2, proceed to base." We then tell them how long we're going to be, and we have then an additional 4 or 5 medical teams put out onto a major incident field in order to provide adequate medical care. We, unfortunately, we're in a really good position and we have a number of people who give up their own time when one of these incidents happens in order to respond to these. We only do so under the direction of the ambulance service, and that's another thing that we have to be very mindful of, is that if it's a double doctor team and neither are blue light trained, well, if one of our ScotSTAR team drivers or one of the off-duty retrieval practitioners is then going to be the blue light driver to get us to the scene in one of our response vehicles, we need to make sure that ambulance control knows who's going and what vehicle and how they can be reached and what call sign. In particular, if there is some safety critical piece of information that comes up, thinking of things like MTA incidents or even incidents involving knives or guns. If something changes or the RVP changes or we can now proceed directly to it, they need to know who's going. So we do that. We previously used WhatsApp, but due to security concerns have moved over now to use Signal as well for informal in-service comms only. So that's things like, can someone bring food to the scene, or such and such is at this hospital, can they please be picked up and taken back to base to restock and get a rest, or that kit is trashed so we need another set of bags. The sort of things that, you know, would overwhelm a major incident talk group on any radio channel. It needs to be recorded, so we use that as part of our log, but it definitely doesn't require or need anything involving individual patient information in that. So that's something that we have learned and used pretty frequently during major incident tests as well as in activations. And we manage to pick holes in the way that we do that each time, such that we learn and we improve every time. So when people tell me more information than is required about why they're unavailable to respond to a major incident, in the cold light of day afterwards, we'll get a text message, an email, or a phone call, or all of the above to say, please don't share that the next time. I didn't need to know all of that. But learning from these and doing test call-ins regularly, I decide every now and again to interrupt people's days by going up to ambulance control and activating the test major incident call-in. And we always have an overwhelming response from large numbers of people offering their time, their services to come in and deliver care. And just finally, our other work doesn't stop. So there are still sick and injured patients across the rest of the country. So the team in the north might not be responding to the major incident, but they might cross-cover more of the country for secondary transfers. They might even just take the referrals and advice calls for all of Scotland at that time to leave us with the bandwidth to be able to process the incident that we're dealing with. And we also have to then think of the next duty period, because these incidents are arresting and fatiguing. We don't want to then have another overnight on-call period or be expected to perform adequately for some challenging transfers after we've dealt with one of these. So we try, if we can, to stand teams down and replace them. And that's one of the roles of our admin staff, is to look at the following duty periods, see who's here just now, when are the next on, are they likely to be able to do that, and to make sure that we've got teams available to undertake the secondary transfers that might still come in as well. So we have to look at the impact of that, not just on the patients that we know we've got from the major incident, but to preserve the core function of the service for the hours and days to come as well.
JP, there's been a lot of work on pre-hospital triage recently, and there really has been an adage around removing these physiological markers for triage and distilling sort of the simple lessons learned, but also just making sure that it is accurate reporting, there's clear signage. What does EMRS advocate in regards to pre-hospital triage?
We are part of the Scottish Ambulance Service, so we very much follow what's in the Scottish Ambulance Service Major Incident Plan, which is the MPTT old style, the one that's fire narrow. So we still use that just now. It won't surprise you that the Scottish Ambulance Service and us, like the rest of the country, is currently working towards adapting and using the Major Incident Triage tool and 10-second triage. We have had some concerns about the unique geography in the way that Scotland is set up, that these tools might result in some unforeseen circumstances or difficulties generated by using a different tool, particularly when it comes to paediatric patients or remote and rural centres, whereby if you had a large number of injured children on an island, they may be over-triaged by using these tools, and that might result in inadequate or inappropriate use of air resources, for example. So we have had some practice and test runs comparing, just for us, using tabletop exercises, what would happen with large numbers of casualties, adult and paediatric, if we use these tools in our circumstances. And we haven't found any major problems with how we are going to deploy that. And we're looking to deploy that sometime in the next 12 months, hopefully, all being well. That's going to result in a huge training requirement for people to be updated, but looking at them as my own opinion and individually, I think they're a hugely positive step. The 10-second triage, in my mind, is going to replace triage sieve for us, so that will be a very quick sort out who's trying to die and who's seriously injured and who isn't. And for us, it maybe will not reflect the distribution of injuries and what we normally see during a major incident, because we don't see many major incidents with large volumes of penetrating trauma, but I recognise why that's there. We're in the lucky position that we don't get as many of those. But it does give us a very rapid use for people who are either under duress or are non-clinical to quickly use these, sort people into categories and start them moving into the appropriate places. For me, it also looks like the 10-second triage will very rapidly identify those who have significant injuries, P1 injuries, but just need to be in hospital because they have surgically important injuries that may have negative effects by having long on-scene times. And that's a big boon, because those P1 patients early on, there has to be a very quick decision of, we need to do enough and move, so we need to do the basics, maybe give them some interventions en route to the hospital, but we need not to wait here, versus the P1 patient who maybe needs some resuscitation and stabilisation, but may be re-triaged after that. I refer to it as the P1iest of the P1s. And that sort of bi-level, bimodal type triage has been used in other places in the world as well. Then looking at the major incident triage tool, I think the great bits about that, including paediatric patients and including things like CPR where appropriate. So looking at incidents like in Korea, where there were large numbers of patients with what appeared to be crush asphyxia, and there were hundreds of bystanders, it may be appropriate for some of those people to have CPR. When you look at previous major incident triage tools, they would have been declared as unsurvivable or dead very early on, and perhaps by someone who's not clinically trained. So that's a big boon. And I think also recognising the difficulties in, again, people under stress, under duress, and trying to triage an under 2 and try and remember the physiological parameters of what an under 2 should be in terms of respiratory rate and heart rate. It also takes out some of the calculation that triage sort used to use before, with calculating GCSs and attributing points. It's not, I think, a particularly useful tool in the heat of battle, because the realistic prospect of these is that it may be a challenging or dangerous environment. It may be difficult because of personal reasons. It may be people that we know. It may be team members that have become injured, or police or fire or other responders that are injured as part of this incident. And we then have to establish, the way that we manage these has to be forward flow towards hospitals early. And I think stopping to try and do all these difficult triage methods hasn't particularly worked in the past. So I look forward to seeing how we manage to adapt it. I look forward to helping my colleagues in the ambulance service train and use it. It's something that I think will result in better care for patients in major incidents.
We're going to pan out in a second and just look more globally, but just before we do, and look at the training requirements to look at cross training in different teams and different specialisms and in different emergency services. But before we go there, JP, just before we pan out, could you speak to, because you just did say some really interesting things, and this real shift of this sort of P1 plus patient, whereby the emergent need to not hold them in a casualty clearing station, but to move them straight through for definitive surgical intervention. Could you maybe speak to your thoughts or I suppose assessment of casualty clearing stations, the lessons learned that you've taken in the past, and indeed some of your sort of current thoughts about casualty clearing?
A very esteemed colleague of mine once referred to casualty clearing as a bit of a speed bump sometimes for some patients, and it can be thus, because when you get into casualty clearing, it's great. There's trestle tables, there's lots of kit, there's lots of personnel, but there's also inertia that can creep in by just being in a casualty clearing. So I think looking at P1 patients in a major incident, that, as I said, that very quick decision of this is a P1 patient who needs X operation, penetrating trauma to the chest or neck, something that needs to not be here. We need to do enough that they are comfortable, they get good trauma care, but that might be while they're en route to hospital, and we're not going to spend ages with them here. Casualty clearing, as I see it, is for those P1 patients who we think after treatment will no longer be P1 because they just need X treatment and they need blood in a chest drain and reassessment. That might be something that we can do there. It may just be that the casualty clearing station, using new triage tools, is where we have a paediatric section and just re-triaging PEDS patients with someone with senior clinical knowledge and has been around and looked after many children, and spend a bit more time re-evaluating, reassessing what the true nature of their injuries are. The thing that I've learned from casualty clearing stations is that the staffing has to be optimal for the operation of them. There's no point in filling them with doctors and critical care teams. Without any disrespect to my medical colleagues, we sometimes find ways to get busy in casualty clearing and can sometimes deliver too many interventions because we can. So we have those tools available to us. And like all trauma care, it's about deciding what things the patient doesn't need and how we can manage them to do enough and do things and limit the risk to the patients from our interventions as well. So I think the best staffing model for these is when you have appropriate officer and advisor people in there. It's also about then having the blend of green, yellow and red resources, as we call it in Scotland. So the green, paramedic and technician, the people that do the bulk of the work for trauma patients and are capable of looking after most of the patients in a casualty clearing, but they will gladly operate alongside and looking after a section of a casualty clearing station, because they have skills and assessment that I haven't. They've worked in the pre-hospital environment for their entire careers. I am a hobbyist in it by comparison. So I think working alongside them as a blended team is the best way. And then having people like our advanced practitioners in critical care, basics GP responders, if it was in a rural community, those yellow or amber level responders who are able both to give senior leadership. Many of them have been in that role for years, having had a huge base of experience working in perhaps one of our teams for 10 or 15 years. And they bring that experience, that leadership, but also their advanced interventions that they can deliver. So that blended model is perhaps the best. And then there's always the debate of how best to deploy and operate with SORT or HART operatives, because they, carry the tents, they carry the casualty clearing stations. But if this is an incident where they're required to operate under the hazardous areas, they won't be in that casualty clearing station at first. But they may be of great use to us whenever the hazardous situation has resolved itself or the patients are all extricated. We do a huge amount of training alongside our SORT teams and I'm proud to call many of them my friends from that training, that we know each other really well, we train alongside each other. And again, we have some of these disagreements and debates in the cold light of day and meetings on Team and Zoom with a cup of chamomile tea, so that when we end up in one of these incidents, everything's smooth and has been agreed and discussed in advance, because we know that they have huge clinical experience. They go to many of these incidents, and there are small numbers, so small numbers of people that are involved in them, so we can train together, quite collaboratively, but in a targeted fashion as well. So I think that's the way that I look at casualty clearing. It can be a speed bump, and the last message is that for those patients that just need to be in hospital, probably don't go via casualty clearing. Go straight from wherever the patient is onto a stretcher to the ambulance loading point and away to hospital, albeit someone has to log that, record it, of where they've gone, what their identifier is, what treatment they've had, and who's with them. But I think putting some of those really sick P1 patients who need an operation into casualty clearing will just slow things down for them, and also occupy resources in that casualty clearing station for some time.
If we could briefly touch on, that was fantastic, and I absolutely agree with you, JP. I think that's extremely prudent. But the cross specialism training piece, you've touched on it there actually with the police, but also with heart teams, and indeed with like you said, 80% of the SAS teams are going to actually see trauma on a day-to-day basis. How important is it to do cross specialism training, and how frequently do you perform that?
So we have regular on-base training. So that is something that we do every day. We train with our air ambulance paramedic colleagues, with the advanced practitioners in critical care, with our team members. So that's, small scale. So that's cross-specialism training. We train with our SORT teams regularly. So we have CPD days that they're invited to come and bring their expertise to. So come and speak to us about an area like CBRN or something that you're experienced in. Come and share your knowledge and experience and training with us, so that we can steal that information and adapt that into the way that we operate. But when they're running training weeks or training events, about getting one of our team members along to maybe deliver some teaching on an area of expertise of theirs. For example, having one of our military colleagues go and teach about ballistic trauma, which is something we don't see much of in Scotland. So those are the kind of smaller scale things. We do try and do these things regularly, but we have annual CPD days in our EMRS team, where we, as a critical care team, bring external speakers and teachers and facilitators in to help deliver some of that training. But one of the big important packages that we have in Scotland is what's called the IPSP, or Interprofessional Specialty Programme, where we have ambulance, police and fire, and then medical teams, and hopefully we can get them back, the SORT teams, where we go along to the Fire and Rescue's National Training Centre just outside of Glasgow and mock up major incidents. So we have large-scale multi-casualty incidents sectored with commanders, with casualty clearing, with all of the assets that you would normally expect. And as I see it, make your mistakes in private, make your mistakes in training, so that you learn from them and you improve. And we have these at least quarterly, and sometimes more frequently if there are other incidents and other exercises that are running. So we took part in one recently that I was involved in, where we ran a hypothetical incident where people had managed to fix themselves onto an elevated structure. So learning about how rope rescue works and rope aspects of care, as well as the legalities of who's allowed to operate in those environments and what they're allowed to do to those individuals, was really important. And then about all of these training exercises, a lot of the value in it is in the debrief, and it's in the tea and coffee afterwards, and the chatting to the fireys that that you've met on this incident, so that the next time you see them on a job, they're like, oh, there's that doctor that was at that incident. I remember, he was an all right guy. Building some of these relationships is something that I've learned over, a decade and slightly more of doing this now, is that, being a friend and being a helpful team member and an asset to them results in better care for your patients forevermore at every incident you go to, because the paramedic will be glad to see you rather than closing the door and trying to drive away without you. The fire and police will know exactly what your capabilities are and what you're able to do. And then the last one is that some of these incidents we won't go into in the warm zone type environment. So armed police colleagues, police from fire and rescue, teams from heart members, SORT members, those types of people do regular things like MTA training, where they will mock up marauding terrorist attack incidents and see how they respond and train together. And we now in EMRS are having some of us go along as observers in some of these incidents in order to learn exactly what they do, what the hazards they're likely to face are. When they say that we need you to come forward and we ask, is it safe? It's unlikely that they're genuinely going to be able to guarantee that something is 100% safe until they've cleared an entire building or examined every inch of that. But if we know that something is safe enough, is that we need to take that as they have made a risk assessment, the patients that are there require some sort of advanced intervention or triage or some decision making, and that we need to know how they operate and how they work in those environments, because these are rare occurrences, but they're really important occurrences. And by going along to these incidents, we can have some input into the way that they deliver casualty care as well. So some pointers on how to apply a tourniquet or where you would do that, or I would do these interventions now if you gave this patient to me. And that really enriched that training for them as well. So training in silo and training without debrief and learning is useless. It's only these things when you combine it with other services, when you debrief and learn from it, and when you actually go away and reflect on it and change your own practice going forward. That's the value in having some of these multi-casualty incidents with all of the disciplines involved that can be.
So JP, I'm aware that you train and teach and indeed steward the major incident training for EMRS. And when you're just coming into land yourself on the training, what do you confer to trainees about your minimum expectation for them if they were to be subject to a major incident? I'm only saying that because when I've been placed into major incident situations, the amygdala hijack is absolutely right there. The adrenaline's running, and it's surprising how quickly you can just forget some of the basics. And so one of the things we learned in London was just doing triaging together, just to bounce ideas off each other, but actually having a partner and indeed staying with a partner, either someone who's another paramedic or a flight doctor or flight paramedic, just to bounce ideas off and not have that and almost de-escalate each other, really. But what do you confer as your minimum expectation to trainees when they're sort of qualifying?
Yeah, we deliver some regular teaching and training to our new retrieval practitioners and our fellows and registrars who come in every 6 to 12 months on rotation. And it's a very good role for people coming out of, the senior part or have perhaps undertaken FEM training elsewhere, but the vagaries and intricacies of working in Scotland need to be teased out a little bit for them. So there's a few bits that I try and get across to our people who are coming to the service for the first time. So again, I'll say it again, some of it's about training and simulation. It's about practice these things when you can, because you don't want your first major incident to be for real. You want to have practiced it before, and we identify and point out the opportunities to get that training. We point out about doing some of this reflective practice, listening to podcasts like this, listening to some podcasts I've recorded elsewhere, just to get your mind into that, right? I'm not doing what I normally do to the full extent, but I'm not suddenly going to start doing things vastly differently. So a major incident is just trauma care, usually, done on a bigger scale, larger numbers of patients. And because of that, we won't necessarily launch into immediately all of our critical care interventions without considering what the opportunity cost of doing those is. So we may set a threshold of you're allowed to do interventions up to the level of this, but do not do any surgical procedures, administer anaesthesia, or give any blood until you've checked in with the MIO to make sure that that's appropriate, because we know that if we get hands-on, we can fast find our way down the full-blown red team resuscitation. One part that I've learned through my own experience was about knowing your kit. So I get this across to them regularly. So know how the equipment works. In a major incident, you won't necessarily have someone to show you how to apply a CAT, or how to change the talk group on your radio, or how to troubleshoot this piece of equipment. So know it inside out. Play with it in the cold light of day. Make sure that some of your on-base training is about, finding the ways that these can fail and practicing with it, and how you can fix it, because you won't necessarily have someone to fall back on. And then the last little bit that I like to make sure that everybody's got is that rapid referral guide, the leg board of here's the 6 things to do. So don your PPE, put on your tabard for your role, start a log, communicate. There's a couple of other bits. If you do those 6 things, you'll be starting off on a good foot. Practice that every time, drill that every time, get that out and look at it regularly so that you're in that mindset of, well, I've done these things, now what? I've done the basics. I've set myself up for success. Now I can just look after the patients. And that's the bit that we always get focused on. And if we forget the very basic things, like I said, it can be a long time into one of these incidents before we realise that something has not been done that was essential in the start. And then the last thing that I try and talk about is that these are challenging incidents for all of us, and that I try and get into them that the debrief process and the aftermath process can be quite challenging. So making sure that you've taken contemporaneous notes and log, and that you've done that, and that if you are struggling after one of these incidents, that is entirely normal. And we have support mechanisms both within our own team but within the wider ambulance service to ensure psychological safety, to ensure that people are okay after these incidents and continue to operate, but that we're also making sure that we know that these incidents will challenge people and can bring up difficult emotions and feelings, and that all of that is completely normal. Any reaction is normal to one of these incidents. And because I think some people that haven't been involved in these really worry about how they'll feel afterwards. And actually, having had a number of these incidents that I've responded to, the overwhelming feeling that I've had after it is pride about the levels of care that our ambulance service has provided, our team has provided, and how far we've come over the last 15 to 20 years in advanced medical care within a framework of an ambulance service in Scotland. So I've always thought after one of these, yes, there were things to improve, but we did a good job today, and I'm really proud of that.
So just as we're coming to land, JP, just a couple more quick questions. One would be just any tools that you advocate for debriefing, and that you would advocate that the team would steward for a hot debrief. And then another would be just any work behind the scenes that you're doing to optimize future incidents. But if you could maybe speak to the debriefing question first, and then just any work in the background.
Yeah, so in the debriefing, I think that's really important. It's something I learned from my wife, who's a paediatric EM consultant and has to debrief quite regularly with stressed or overwhelmed ambulance crews who've brought in, difficult circumstances, big cases, and she's, one of the best at, talking them down, keeping them calm, talking through what their concerns are, identifying how to address those, and then making sure that they've got contact for afterwards. So they've got peer support, they've got someone that they can ask more questions to if they've got them, and that, the local manager or ambulance control knows that they've had a really challenging job. They need to be returned to get a rest break and have a welfare check, etc. The one tool that I would advocate using, developed by a couple of friends and colleagues of mine, both from Lanarkshire and Edinburgh, is the Stop 5 tool, which has been published by colleagues in Edinburgh's emergency department, but with help from the SIM Centre in Forth Valley and a friend of mine in Lanarkshire. And that gives a really useful framework for any incident that's challenging, but it helps to keep it focused, because if it's not focused on what the agenda is, it just goes on and on and on. So the hot debrief, I think a Stop 5 is perfect for that. The cold debrief, the one thing I would say is, from experience, having had a number of these, is that having a really good trained facilitator who's trained in debriefing these incidents and runs it so that the voices are heard of everybody going. Because otherwise it can be one overwhelming voice that runs the whole thing, and the people that were actually first on scene are forgotten about. So having a trained facilitator to run these cold debriefs can really help to keep it on track and make sure that everybody feels that they've had their say, they've been able to ask questions, and they've learned and reflected, so that the next one they go to, the lessons have been learned if there were things to be improved. And then finally, the last bit, just to look at things behind the scenes to improve things. For a number of years now, I've been part of our National Risk and Resilience Department's Patient Safety and Quality Group, and there's a few aspects amongst that I think are big wins and have succeeded in improving things. So mass casualty analgesia is something that previously we knew about, but perhaps didn't address properly. So now our SORT teams carry large volumes of Penthrox, which is available, which is appropriate in many patients, but there are some that aren't appropriate. And of course, it's not necessarily licensed for use in the under 16s, albeit it is used in some places. But there's work ongoing to try and use Actimorph or oral morphine type things. That is rapidly acting and can be used in the full range of ages to make sure that those P3 patients that might have a bit of a wait, if they are deferred transfer to hospital, will still be getting the care. And then the last thing is that I have been involved in so many of these now that I've seen how things can work. And the important part about the debriefing process is it's fine to identify the same issues time and time again, and the one that always comes up is communication. But unless we make that better, it will continue to be the first thing in any debrief that is raised as was an issue. So practicing these things, doing call-in tests, making sure that Dr. X is able to operate the radio and change the talk group, addressing all these things in CPD days, and trying to provide people with a framework of competences so that they can show that they've thought about these things and trained in these things, so that if one of these incidents happens and someone asks you for it as part of a witness statement or as part of a fatal accident or coroner's inquiry, that we're able to show that we have tried to do our best to prepare ourselves best to give the best level of care that our patients deserve.
JP, thank you so much for your time. I'm mindful that we've gone just over the hour, but it's absolutely fantastic and fascinating to get your reflections on, like I said, the past 20 years, some of the lessons learned in that time, but also the way you approach it from a systems and processes perspective. So that's absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for your time.
Not at all. If you've got any listeners that need to ask any further questions, anything that they want to ask questions about, develop further, you can get me on Twitter at JP Loughrey. Happy to take any questions about that.
You're listening to the Pre-Hospital Care podcast on the Medics Academy Network.